We as ADB need to incorporate digital into our DNA. We also need to do more to help the region accelerate its digital transformation. Together, we can emerge from the pandemic stronger, more inclusive, and sustainable.
Hello, and welcome back to Digital X ADB and to the panel discussion on startups and their ecosystem, what role for development finance. I'm Nata Suda with ADB Ventures, the Asian Development Bank's venture arm, and your host today. Before we begin, a quick reminder that if you're on the virtual event platform, you can use the Q&A function to post questions to the speakers, which will be answered after the presentations are over. Now, it is my pleasure to invite our moderator for today's session, Mr. Timur Nabili, Executive Producer at Tech for Impact.Asia. Mr. Nabili, the floor is yours.
Nat, thank you very much indeed. And welcome everybody. Good morning. A pleasure to have you here. As Nat said, my name is Timur Nabili, and my role this morning is to guide you through the conversations that we're going to have with a stellar lineup of participants today, talking about startups, startup ecosystems, and the role of finance, particularly development finance, in making those ecosystems successful and sustainable. We're going to begin, though, in this particular session with some opening remarks from our Vice President this morning. Ashok Lavasa is the VP for Private Sector Operations and Public-Private Partnerships at the ADB. Vice President, over to you.
Thank you, Timur. Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm audible. It is my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Timur. It's my pleasure to participate in today's discussion. Technology startups have emerged as important drivers of economic transformation. Their role and impact has been felt during the pandemic more than ever. And I should say that while adjustments were not easy, many innovative and agile tech startups were able to adjust quickly and emerge stronger from the COVID-19 crisis. Venture capital took note, and global investment soared 95% from the first half of 2020 to the first half of 2021. The number of unicorns valued at more than $1 billion rose 43% between October 2020 to June 2021. Asia and the Pacific have shared these economic benefits. The People's Republic of China enjoyed $37 billion of venture funding for the first 5 months of this year. India alone spawned 24 new unicorns from January to August. Large markets, as we can see, will allow successful ventures to scale quickly. But there are also regional success stories that have given rise to startup unicorns like Gojek, Grab, and Sea. Digital transformation begets economic transformation. In addition to creating economic value and new jobs, digital platforms help traditional businesses, especially MSMEs, achieve efficiencies and access previously unreachable markets. Digital platforms simplify logistics and integrate value chains across borders, making them vehicles for regional integration and cooperation. Digital marketplaces give individuals and households greater convenience and wider choices. However, digital transformation also comes with growing pains. An ever-changing landscape of business models and technology requires governments to re-examine policy in areas including competition, data access, privacy, security, and taxation. Changing labor markets challenge governments to reskill and upskill workers while updating labor and social protection policies. Central banks must find ways to engage with new financial technologies and accommodate increasing demand for safe and secure digital financial services. The second challenge is infrastructure. For many, the affordability of devices and data plans, as well as access to electricity, still determine participation in the digital economy. ADB estimates that the region will need to invest $910 billion over the next 5 years in mobile and broadband services. Much of this investment will come from the private sector. The third challenge is to foster the emergence and growth of startups ecosystems. I'm joined on today's panel by Startup Blink, which ranks the world's startup ecosystems. 8 of ADB's developing member countries currently sit in Startup Blink's 50 best countries for startups. These startup ecosystems involve complex interplay of public services, public incentives, enabling institutions, mentors, private investors, corporations, and entrepreneurs. They are complex, nuanced, and take time to mature. Building them requires robust participation from the public sector, private sector, and academia. The approaches and pathways to success vary greatly, and there seems to be no universal secret sauce, but rather a need for context-aware collaborative approaches. Today's panel discussion asks the question, what role is there or ought there to be for development finance in the Asia-Pacific region's startup-led digital transformation? The answers, I expect, will span the breadth of ADB's operations. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you. Thank you, Timur.
VP, thank you very much indeed for setting the scene there and outlining what are the big picture challenges and opportunities. Before we let you go, and I hope you'll stick around for the panel a little later on, but just quickly address the question that you put. What role is there for development finance institutions in the startup-led digital transformation model? Just give me your quick sense of what that amounts to.
Thank you. I think if you look at the role of a development financial institutions like the Asian Development Bank, what you will find is that the ADB is in a very good position to understand the purpose for which the technology is employed. So it is not that ADB is supporting technology just for the sake of technology, but what is the purpose for which technology is used? For example, take energy efficiency, or take the entire gamut of climate finance and adaptation or mitigation related technologies which are used for achieving climate action. So I think in ADB's ability to understand the purpose for which technologies are employed, and especially ADB has learned to take a differentiated approach to each of our developing member countries. We consider the size of the market, the clusters of innovation present there, the level of infrastructure, the state of the enabling policy environment, and access to finance, while also listening and being responsive to our clients. Clearly, ADB has a role to play in financing digital infrastructure. As I said in my opening remarks, that you have vast areas where even though digitalization is required, but the adequate infrastructure, both in terms of public infrastructure and in terms of individual capacities, don't exist. So a lot of work that will catalyze these investments, which will enhance regional connectivity, bridge the digital divide, and diversifying the digital economy across sectors. We can also unlock and de-risk private sector finance. One approach to this is the one we are taking with ADB Ventures, which aims to co-invest with and thereby catalyze direct private sector investment in high impact early stage technology companies.
All right.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, VP. And we'll talk to ADB Ventures in this session very shortly. And hopefully we'll get more from you in the hour to come as well. But let's move on and consider some of the issues that the VP was putting up there. I hope a lot of you managed to get a chance to view the video that was showed before this session. The seminar, Building Innovation Ecosystems in Developing Asia and the Pacific, was a really interesting setup for this particular discussion. It discussed the economic importance of startups and in particular startup ecosystems. And as the VP suggested there, how we should be aware of the context and of collaborative approaches in setting these things up. And these are some of the themes we'll be putting to our guests today. If you did miss that session, that video, it will be online. So please do take a chance to catch up with it. But let's take the discussion on now through various elements of what the VP was outlining and various elements of the challenges and opportunities that we've touched on so far. And we're going to talk firstly to a particular context and a very specific challenge environment in which some of these ideas need to be considered. And I'm joined now by Balor Erdenbat-Sengel, who is the chairwoman of the Government of Mongolia's Communication and Information Technology Authority. Now, she is the first woman to hold the position. She's also the youngest leader in the cabinet of Mongolia, and she has been key in crafting the 5-year plan of the country to transform it into a digital nation. And who better then to start talking and giving us some insights into what the first steps are in creating digital ecosystems and what the challenges are for that. Balor, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a great pleasure.
Everybody.
So look, let's begin with your context. I mean, tell me about the challenges in Mongolia. Tell me about the opportunities in Mongolia and how you think that your experiences can fit into this broader conversation about building startup ecosystems.
Thank you, Timur. So the government of Mongolia has brought the agenda to become a digital nation. And when we talk about becoming a digital nation, the main ingredient of being the digital nation is creating ecosystem for startups, SMEs, and even citizens to use digital platforms for their lives, for their work, for their schools. So as we all know, the pandemic for the past 2 years has had good impact on accelerating the startups. Actually, we have seen very good impact in Mongolian startups during the pandemic. There has been a lot of startups that gained investment from various local investors during the lockdown. So when you're in the lockdown, a lot of traditional businesses and citizens, as well as the policymakers, understood the importance of technology. So in our plan, one of the biggest challenges for us is the lack of ICT professionals. So as you know, we have 3 million people in such big land, sandwiched between Russia and China. But the good thing is the average IQ level of Mongolian is very high, higher than most countries. I think we're in one of the top 3 countries to have such IQs. So many girls and children have been discouraged to become IT professionals in the past decade or so, but now the education system has been changing towards that, towards progressive ICT professionals, creating ICT communities. So another challenge we had was regulatory environment that now the government and the parliament has been working together to improve. I get a lot of comments from startup companies regarding financing capacity. So especially smaller startups, local startups need support from the government or international various organizations, and they specifically want grants. So there are matching grants, there are a lot of investment options, but according to these startups, they want even small amount of grants. So we have seen positive impact with the World Bank. We have implemented a pilot project to give out grants for early stage startups. But on the other hand, startups are drawn from real life problems. So the ideas, the issues that Mongolian startups are solving is very, very wonderful, and the apps that have been developed in the past few months is just amazing how quickly technology can solve social problems in emerging markets, not only in Mongolia, but we have seen this trend in many Asian countries, which is great, and especially for young people, to have their voice heard, to have their problem solved. They're using technology for that. So
Right.
It's a global trend.
It's an interesting element of the conversation is that the problems that you're talking about, they're local problems and they need local solutions. But it also brings us to that element that I think is pervasive to this whole conversation, and that is, to what extent does the local and the global collide, or at least interact? Because you've got situations like in Mongolia where you have to deal with your own regulatory system and your own environment, and yet there is this global knowledge pool of solutions, of ideas, of expertise that can bring to bear. So just how are you considering that at Mongolian government level about the interaction between the local and the international, in particular things like engaging with operations like the ADB and engaging with other global institutions and knowledge?
Mm-hmm. So as a government, especially as for me, who's leading the ICT authority of the government of Mongolia, I believe that one of my role for that specific issue is connecting Mongolian startups to these organizations, connecting Mongolian startups and companies, as well as SMEs to international technology investors, hubs, so they can learn more from them, and also have them publicized in the startup world and technology world. So we have been doing a lot of work in terms of connecting Mongolian startups with global companies, international organizations.
Okay, Balor, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction to the situation in Mongolia. Hopefully you're going to stick around and we'll chat with you more in the panel coming up towards the end of the session. And folks, while you're watching, let me just say the Q&A section in the Zoom platform is open. I want to conduct this particular event as an ongoing collaboration and conversation between everybody, not just the people that we're talking to as special guests. So if you do have a question for Balor or a question for any of our other people, or just a general observation, pop it into the Q&A session and we'll try and figure it in to the proceedings as we go along. Because the proceedings that we've got today are slightly unusual. We're going to have a series of short conversations like that one with some of our guests, and then bring them all together for a broader conversation amongst all of them together. So please do participate where and when you can and get involved. So for the next session of this particular procedure, we're going to go from Balor's very local Mongolia-based perspectives to a much broader perspective. And I want to bring in now Paul Vandenberg, who is a senior economist at the ADB Economic Research Department. And he researches into many things, including things like middle income trap, employment, small and medium enterprises and such. Last year, he was the co-author of the ADB Institute's paper on the financing of tech startups in selected Asian countries. So Paul, I guess that's a great place to start. Tell me about that paper, just in very brief, if you could, and the financing of tech startups, and this question of local context-aware solutions.
Okay, thank you, and greetings everyone, wherever you are, at whatever time you are. Yeah, no, that paper was interesting because we started out and we wanted to learn more about the startups ecosystem, and particularly finance. And I think what's true of a lot of us is that we're a bit new to this idea of startups and the ecosystem, and we wanted to understand it. Our major finding, I think, was that we tend to assume or associate startups with venture capital. Okay, so you think Silicon Valley, you think of all the startups there, you think of all the venture capitalists are also there that fund them. And I think what we found was that there was a much more diversified range of funding sources that startups used. Okay, and this is especially true when they're young and they're just starting out, right? And venture capital funds don't want to fund them yet because they're still too untried and untrue. And therefore, it was very interesting to hear our previous speaker on Mongolia talk about the fact that startups like to have grants, right? So venture capital gives equity, but startups, when they're really starting out, what they want is grants. I mean, obviously, it's nice to have a grant because you don't have to pay it back and you don't give away any equity. But that's one of the things that we found. We also found they used other little funding sources. Obviously, they financed a bit by themselves from their savings and so on. Some people who started a venture kept their day job, so they were taking their salary and funneling that into their startup. But we also found things like pitch competitions in which startups would pitch their idea and they would give prize monies for the best pitch. And that was good because that could be a bit of pre-seed, seed money to help them develop their product. So those were some of the main things we found.
And plenty of challenges, as in the ADB challenge program that's going on, where they're offering small seed money and grants like that. But Paul, what are the relative sizes of these different funding sources? And is the non-venture part of that funding environment as organized, as coordinated, as easily accessible to the startups? I mean, how viable is it as a preliminary source?
Okay, so first question, the amounts usually are not that much. I think we're often talking about $5,000 to $10,000, which you think about it is not a lot of money. But the thing is that we have to understand that when startups are starting up, often what they're doing is not, operating yet. They're actually developing their idea. And sometimes that means they have to prototype, for example. They have to do more research. They have to figure out how it works, it's going to work and apply to the market. So small bits of funding can actually be kind of helpful to get them into that testing, prototyping, development stage, and to fund the activities because they don't have any revenue yet. So that's quite. But anyways, I think we're speaking fairly small amounts of money. Is that source of funding coordinated? I don't think so. I don't think it generally is. It comes from a variety of places. Sometimes governments will put up small amounts of money or have grant programs, which is good for the startups to do. In terms of the prize money from pitch competitions, those tend to be ad hoc and not a regular form of financing. But the interesting thing that we found in many of the countries that we're studying is that there's a surprising number of pitch competitions that have been set up by various organizations. So it's a thriving market in some place. One of the really interesting things we found, if I could just add, is that we found also in some countries there were what we called serial pitchers. And these were startups which would go from competition to competition and try to get, win several competitions and get the money from that. And the researchers that looked at this phenomena for us, they were kind of saying, well, shouldn't these startups be spending a little bit more time on developing their product and not so much time on pitching all the time? So we were concerned about these serial pitchers. Thank you.
I guess you can credit them with being entrepreneurial in that regard. But as far as the landscape is concerned, what about the role of the public sector? I mean, as I said, the ADB runs some of these small challenges and gives these small funds, but in general, the ADB's role is for big infrastructure plays. So what role do you think ADB and the public sector in general can play in that ecosystem or in that environment of startup funding?
That's a very good question. And I think, I said earlier, I'm trying to understand, ADB is trying to understand better the ecosystem. And I think as part of that, we're trying to understand where to intervene. So obviously, as one of the previous speakers suggested, one of the ways is, of course, helping with the digital infrastructure, because it tends to be a public sphere that we tend to invest in. But the question, I think, is more about, do we as a finance institution get away from, or in addition to our traditional areas of funding, which is infrastructure, do we also try to do other things that can sort of help this? And one of the ways, of course, is to support incubators and accelerators. And I think we have a project now in Azerbaijan that is doing specifically that. But on the issue of finance, I think that's a really important question, because, we are talking about startups which are private sector, and ADB does a lot of lending to the public sector, but how can it support the private sector? And there, I think, certainly we have ADB Ventures, which is interesting, and we'll hear about that. But I think one of the really interesting questions for us, if I could throw that out there, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting the ADB in doing this or opening a can of worms, is that we actually do a fair amount of lending to support finance to SMEs. Okay, and this is on the sovereign side. I mean, we lend money to financial institute, or to the government, that goes to financial institution that is then lent out to SMEs. And there's no reason why, I don't think, we can't do the same thing for startups. I mean, I see a lot of projects coming across my desk, because I have to sort of analyze these things, in which we provide financing indirectly, through government to SMEs. But I haven't seen many projects, or any projects, in which we channel it specifically to startups. And maybe that's something we should think about.
Apart from ADB Ventures, of course, which we'll talk about in just a moment.
That's right.
That's fascinating stuff, Paul. Thanks very much indeed for that. Let's move on to our next guest, and do stick around if you would, Paul. We'll talk to you again a little bit more in detail later on. And just a reminder to the audience, please, if you've got questions for Paul, pop them in the Q&A session and we'll put them to him. But let's move on from that big picture look to the ecosystem in particular, because the existence of ecosystems is one of the things that one of our guests in the pre-recorded video previously brought up. Stefan Kuster of Startup Genome talked about how a healthy supporting ecosystem for startups can have a major impact on the economic development of the country. Let's look at that situation a little bit more closely. Eli David joins us now. He's the CEO of Startup Blink, which is a research center that maps and indexes startup ecosystems around the world. And he's worked with dozens of governments and organizations to grow those ecosystems. So Eli, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Let me just ask you a very quick question to begin with about the relevance and the value of this ecosystem thinking in the context of startups. Why is the ecosystem and the supporting community of participants important here, rather than just getting each individual startup to the best place it can be?
Hey, Timur, thanks for inviting me. Yes, the ecosystem is critical, because we cannot build startups on our own. We're dependent on a level of a network that we have in our cities, in our countries, on our legislation, and so on. So everything coming together is basically giving you either a boost or decreasing your chances of success. One of the things that we always say in Startup Blink is, make sure that you're in the right ecosystem. Many startups are not aware that by choosing the right place to, let's say, to build their startup, they're actually very much influencing their chances of success. So as far as we're concerned, we're trying to instill this message, not only to the startups themselves, but also to the public sector that is building those ecosystems, to let them know that there is real urgency to move and develop very fast, because if you're staying behind, you're basically losing your best people. Because
that's interesting.
The most ambitious people do know that they have to be in the right place, and they have no patience.
So when you say the right ecosystem, do you mean the right country ecosystem, or the right ecosystem within your own city? Because these are two different propositions.
Absolutely. The country generally is giving you everything that has to do with legislation, with infrastructure and so on. But when we look at an ecosystem, we look more than anything on a city, because in the end of the day, that's the place where you meet the investors. That's the place where you go to meetups and share knowledge about how to build your startup. That's the place where you meet potential co-founders and suppliers or clients and so on. So it is actually a physical place. And because it is a physical place, it really depends on the country. If it would be Singapore, I would say the country, because it's a one city country. But if it's a more vast, let's say, country, let's say like Mongolia, you would say Ulaanbaatar is the ecosystem in a way.
All right, so Startup Blink compiles an index of the best cities for startups. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us a little bit about the ADB developing member countries' position in that list, and particularly their trajectories. How is Asia developing and growing in this startup ecosystem environment?
Yeah, so the ranking takes into account, basically it's built on an interactive map. You can see both the map and the rankings at startuplink.com. And we collect many thousands of, many tens of thousands of data points to be in a situation that we have a ranking algorithm, about 40 parameters of what is the output of the ecosystem. Asia is advancing relatively fast. We're seeing massive advance. There is a power shift a little bit between Asian countries and also the West. For example, we do see a shift of Asian countries and cities going above European countries and so on, more and more. Some of it has to do with the sheer market size of those Asian countries, and the bigger the country is, in a way, the more it has, let's say, potential of growth, which is a very low-hanging fruit.
Right.
So
which explains why Jakarta is the highest ranking on your list outside of the global situation within the Asian ecosystem. Is Jakarta up there simply by dint of its size, or are there other aspects to the Jakarta ecosystem that makes it attractive?
Yeah, actually, it's exactly what you mentioned. Jakarta is relatively high. Of course, we have, first of all, at number 3 and number 6, Beijing and Shanghai, which are incredibly high. Then we have also in the Asian context, Bangalore at number 10, New Delhi at number 14, Mumbai is there as well. I should have made it clear, Jakarta outside of China and India, which clearly are yes, the big centers of gravity. Yes, although we have to say there are also a few very interesting global ecosystems which are let's say in the style of Singapore and so on, that are also performing very well, and those are the ecosystems that I'm really interested in, because they actually have a very small local market, but still manage to create so much impact in their region. Jakarta, to your question, Timur, is enjoying a very big market size of about 230, I think, million population. So it's a low-hanging fruit. It's relatively difficult for outsiders to enter, let's say, this market. But then again, we also say that there is also a curse in being a big country, because then the entrepreneurs, because they see so much market potential, they will develop solutions mainly for their own country. And I think that the interesting case study that we see globally are actually the Singapores, the Israels, the Estonia, the small countries that know that from day one, they have to go and internationalize. They cannot look at their local market as their, let's say, a solution on the long term. And that creates a very global ecosystem as well. So I just want to make it clear that the smaller countries actually have a very big advantage on the long term, because their entrepreneurs are geared toward a global, let's say, strategy. Interesting. And very quickly, Eli, before we let you go, what about the ADB's role in all of this? How can it pull on some levers to try and grow these innovation ecosystems around the Asian developing countries? So I connected a lot with what Paul said, and also what Balor said, in the sense of help try to ignite the ecosystem, do those events and so on, try to be in a situation that I'm looking at an ecosystem always as a snowball, as an avalanche. How does every avalanche starts? With a small snowball. And the problem is that the private sector itself, we cannot expect it to be there in the initial phase, because there is no return on investment. So we have to basically start the big snowball by rolling it for the private sector, and then very, very quickly get out of the way and let the private sector do their thing. So I would say that we just have to discover where is the mechanism has not started rolling yet. Interfere there, promote, engage. Remember that we're at the end of the day very, very dependent on our entrepreneurs. At the end of the day, if they're not moving, nothing is going to move. So remember our role, which is removing roadblocks, getting it initiated in the initial phase, and then staying out of the way. That's what I would recommend.
Interesting. I'm going to take you up on that a little later on, hopefully, and maybe Balor can join in too about whether getting out of the way is what government should be doing, or whether they should be playing an ongoing sustaining role for the ecosystems. But we'll get onto that in a minute. Thanks a lot, Eli, and we'll chat with you in just a second. Let's get on now to Sherwin Pu and talk about some of the ADB's role in all of this. Sherwin Pu is leading the business development team in the private sector operations department, and specifically ADB Ventures, which was set up under the PSOD, as you know. It's a venture arm trying to support and invest in technology startups to drive SDG impact. Sherwin, thanks a lot for being with us. The evolution of ADB Ventures has been an interesting one, and particularly in the context of this conversation we're having now. We focused on how startups can influence digital transformation and private sector development, but are there ways that they can also advance the regional development agenda? Tell us about the role that you're playing in all of this.
Thank you very much, Timo. And first, I would like to give some high remarks to what the other panelists said just now. Actually, the contents are really rich. It's really nice. I think it will be helpful to a lot of colleagues in ADB. Then about my views of how startups can advance the region's development agenda. I would like to change the angle a little bit. It's more about how startups can advance the region's development agenda. Of course, when the startup started a business, when they put their business plan, one big question probably they need to think about is that whether they are doing something good for the development agenda, and whether they will contribute to some of the development impacts, if they have intention to contribute to that. But then, it's probably a little bit strange when I say this, when I wear ADB hat, is in the implementation, in the execution, when they do the daily business, I would say that don't think too much about the development impact or development agenda. Focus on your business and be very focused on what you intend to do, because the success rate, as mentioned by my panelist here, it's the success rate in the startup space is not very high. And in order to deliver the impact you try to achieve, the most important thing is that you need to be successful, you need to survive, and you need to eventually reach to the finish line. And to a certain extent, without being scaled up, any development impact will be meaningless. So that's why I say that for the startups, the most important thing is that be successful and try to scale up and put the development agenda in your design and follow your business plan and try to scale up as fast as possible.
Yeah, which I guess explains why ADB Ventures has chosen to position itself along that continuum of venture investing into startups in the sort of slightly more mature end of the spectrum, talking to companies that have already achieved a certain amount of business viability. But tell us a little bit about how you assess that situation and the funding gap that you're trying to address. I mean, we heard earlier on about the need for lower level funding in some of these developing member countries.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say that if you really look at different stages of startups, I would say that what ADB Ventures currently financing is not very matured, and our investment fund one tends to invest in Series A stage startups. So typically, we're talking about the company start to earn revenues, but still, I would say that making loss or making negative cash flows every month. At the same time, they are they're still far away from reaching to business success. In terms of their business uncertainty, they still have a lot of I would say that obstacles to overcome in the coming months, years. So what we are trying to look at is really, I would say that those sectors which can contribute to development agenda, but have been overlooked by I would say that the VC market at this moment. For example, typically the VC funds, they have a fund life of between 6 to 10 years. 10 years are probably already very long in the VC market. But for some of the startups, for example, in the agri-tech space or in the clean tech space, you probably need 5-6 years before you really start to earn your first dollar revenue. So that's why I would say that there is a funding gap in the market in the early stage startups, like typically seed, Series A. Those startups actually are very difficult to raise venture capital financing to support their scale up. And then what we are looking at right now is like another funding gap we identified earlier, which is I would say that relatively late stage, probably Series B, C. Those startups need additional capital to scale up, but at that time, the equity capital would be too expensive for them to use to support that stage of scale up. So we are trying to raise the second fund, which will be a debt fund, to support that stage of funding gap.
Fantastic. Sherwin, thanks very much indeed for that. Let's get on then in the final 20 minutes that we've got here into a more broader discussion around some of these themes involving all our participants today, and hopefully the audience. Please do pop some questions into the chat there if you want to engage with our audience. There is already one in there, and let me put it to Balor. Balor, you've probably seen that question already in the chat session, talking about grants for tech startups and SMEs and the similarities between them, and do policies differentiate between those two? How do you address that apparent imbalance?
So the current regulatory environment, before what we had, does not differentiate between the SMEs and startups. Now the Parliament is discussing several laws that to be approved hopefully in the next few weeks that differentiates startups. So creating ecosystem for startups. I think the main factor that differentiates between these two is the technology involving. So SMEs do have factory. It's more physical, and startup companies are more technology-based, operating in the cloud system using AI, blockchain, etc., etc. But one interesting thing during the pandemic was that one of the support programs that government provided to companies did not differentiate. So all the SMEs and startups were able to get supports from the government during the pandemic.
Sherwin, you wanted to say something on this? Thanks, Balor. That's great. Let me bring in Sherwin. I think he had something he wanted to add.
Yeah, actually, I just want to add something about, let's say, the grant funding for startups. As some of you know that ADB Ventures has we call a reimbursable grant piece for like like seed stage startups. But that instrument is not something totally free for the startups. It still has some string attached to it. The reason is that we, like from our perspective, we don't really believe that to give a pure grant, free money to startup is a good thing. And as Paul mentioned earlier, that he sees varieties of fundings to very early stage startups, let's call idea stage startups. Typically, family, friends give some monies to let's say to incubate the business. That part of money actually, although it's from family and friends, but typically I would say that that's probably the most expensive money, because you need to make sure that eventually you can get something back to your family members, get something back to your friends, and so it's not like something no string attached. At the same time, I would say that for those startups, like move from pitch to pitch, trying to get grant money, typically I would say that personally, I see that they are not really focused. I saw that some governments have really good programs. I would say that it will try to differentiate some of the SME from tech startups, is that they have some matching fundings. So if you get some VC fundings to your business, the government can provide some matching funding to it. And personally, I think this is a really good way to support early stage startups from the government.
Right. Thanks a lot, Sherwin. I want to bring Eli in on this. Actually, Eli, I mean, we've been talking about funding here, but we didn't give you a chance to add what your experience has been in this funding gap question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm a little bit with Sherwin here. I'm very worried about interference in the regular state of business, let's say, because if startups are indeed, and I've seen a few ecosystems where startups are basically using most of their time to fill in forms instead of building their product and so on, and we definitely don't want this to happen. So I think that we as public sector developers, we have to be very aware of where is the fine line between giving an initial boost and actually distorting a little bit the ecosystem. I've seen a few ecosystems that are mainly in Europe, by the way, that create a situation that there is so much support, and I look at it as hand-holding of someone taking your hand and basically bringing you to the next step. And then at some point, you're going to have to leave them. And you would have some resentment over there of why did you help me in the seed stage and you don't help me now in the scaling stage? I have to say that a lot of, surprisingly, a lot of countries that have been relatively not that active on startup ecosystem development. Israel is a good example of it. People think that a lot of it was created by the policies, but it's not the case. Basically, a lot of what the government did over there is just leave the startups alone and not do damage, not create over bureaucracy and so on. And just by doing that, the ecosystem has grown. So right. I would be very careful of playing too much of a central planner role over here. That's
Eli. That's the second time you've mentioned the public-private role in that sort of political ideological sense. So let's pick up on that for a second, if we could. And perhaps I'll put this question to Paul as an economist and hopefully an independent voice here. But one of the things that came out of the video that we played earlier on, Thomas Abel of the ADB talked about the experiences of South Korea, which has spent 50 years being very active in developing a startup ecosystem and trying to put a lot of government involvement. And Thomas said, if you look at all the success stories in Korea and all the experiences they've had, and they've tried pretty much everything out there, he says, you can see that in everything that has succeeded, there has been, to some extent, some measure of government involvement in all of those things. Thomas is not the only one to bring this up. There's a lot of conversation about this. So from your economic perspective, Paul, tell me about what you think about the need for governments to play an ongoing and sustaining role in developing these ecosystems.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, it's kind of a broad question because I think we have a sort of a general question. Can it support things like incubator, digital infrastructure, training of engineers, which are certainly needed? And I think certainly they have a good role to play in most of those activities. I think the question which the other panelists, Sherwin and other, are talking about is the financing side of it. So should the governments actually provide grant funding? And I think that's a critical question, and it's a really important question. And prior to sort of starting to look at startups, I would be against that. But it's interesting that that a number of governments have actually set up programs like that to give grant funding. Now, in some cases, and you could think about how that might distort a market or not be very market oriented. In some cases, the grants actually take the form of research grants. Okay, and there is fairly good support generally, if we think of industrial policy, for governments providing funding, grant funding to enterprises if it's particularly designed to help them with their R&D. And I think we can carry that idea over to startups if it's funding for R&D and to develop the ideas, then we tend to think that maybe that's a good investment.
Balor, let me ask you, can the government afford to leave this ecosystem development to the private sector or other champions? I mean, what is the ongoing role of governments in maintaining and sustaining the ecosystem?
Again, I think you have to sort of break it down and say what
Paul,
parts of the ecosystem, because of course there's a government role in digital infrastructure, there's a government role in training tech people, so those parts of it, certainly there's a government role. I think. All right,
Paul, let me stop you there. I want to get a government perspective on this, if I could, and bring Balor in with that question.
Thanks.
Well, I agree with Paul. Actually, we have a lot of discussions about this in Mongolia. Some of the people in private sector believe that ICT sector in general and specifically startup should not have its freedom and should not be dependent on government and its decision making for the long term. But again, there are areas that government has to jump in, as Paul said, infrastructure for sure, digital literature, literacy issues, as well as regulatory environment. So there is a very thin line between how government should involve into startup ecosystem. And from other countries' cases, we have seen successful cases for government being involved in the ecosystem, like Singapore, for example. And we have seen unsuccessful cases as well. So I think it's very up to countries and actually startup companies and young people, how they want the government to operate. So for Mongolian perspective, we make sure to hear, listen what startup companies want, what they need, and we want to have their opinion involved while we develop policies.
Let's move on then and close out with, I guess, the other side of the coin. I mean, we've been talking about what are positive policies to implement and how we should be focusing activities in developing the ecosystems. Let's talk about what we shouldn't be doing. Eli, tell me, are there ecosystem building activities that are positively damaging? Are there things that should be avoided when talking about this thing, whether it be in financing and how that financing is done or in any other capacity?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think there are any, because what can be disastrous at one stage in a specific country or a city can be extremely beneficial in another stage of a city and country. So we just have to look at each startup ecosystem as its own unique patient, analyze it, try to understand exactly what is happening there, and then prescribe the right amount of a dose. Let's say it can be grants, it can be building more incubators, co-working spaces, and so on. So as far as I'm concerned, this is very much customized. I will say that the most important thing for us as ecosystem developers is to strategically show our obsession about startup ecosystem development, because I have to say that even in cases where I've seen mistakes being made on startup ecosystem development, as long as there was passion and there was the need to reiterate and go back and understand how important our startup ecosystems are to us, I've seen governments that got it wrong in the beginning and then basically got it right. So I would just advise to be obsessed about the topic of startup ecosystem development in your city and country. You will make some mistake. In a way, you are a startup yourself. As a startup ecosystem development, you're trying things that are not necessarily going to succeed. But just continue to be obsessed on it, because that's the path of success. Because the worst thing to do is to ignore it and just say, I rely on my tourism sector, I rely on my manufacturing sector, and so on. So that would be it.
Shoin, just address, if you would, this question of context awareness and local applicability of conditions and solutions and products. You spoke earlier on about, the necessity to think bigger, to think cross-border, to think about the ability to scale into other markets that are not your home market. So is that a contradiction? Is that a conflict in approach here? How do we weigh these things up?
It's a good question. Actually, my answer is no. Actually, in terms of the scalability and also tailoring the solution for any specific market, I see that these are two sides of the same coin. And to scale up is to make the startup successful and make the startup, I would say that eventually can deliver more financial and development impact to the society. But at the same time, to make the solution tailored or more suitable to a local market is one way actually to make the company sustainable, scalable. For example, we have seen some companies started from one local market, for example, from China, from Vietnam, and gradually they move to the overseas market and develop. Although it's the same suite of product, but tailored for different, for example, change the language or try to target the different needs in a specific market. Personally, I see that it's just it's try to make the company more successful and try to deal with a specific market issue. I don't see these two things are really conflicting to each other.
And Paul, let me leave you with a final wrap-up comment. I mean, in the broader conversation that we're having about the role of development finance, you talked about the ADB's position in this. Where do you think it's evolving to? I mean, how do you see this landscape evolving and developing as we go ahead? Because it seems the momentum around startups and ecosystem thinking is only getting stronger. And the rest of the institutions that have been playing a different game will need to evolve. How do you see it going?
Absolutely. First of all, just to say that you see that because we have ADB Ventures now, which we didn't have a while ago. So obviously the bank is realizing we need to get into the space. I think the where it's going is kind of what I talked about a little bit earlier. It is our support. Is our focus on startups going to be contained within ADB Ventures, or is ADB going to have a broader perspective and say, well, look, it shouldn't be just in that one modality, even though that's a good modality. How do we affect startups more broadly across our activities? Let me just give you one quick example. We lend a lot of money for education projects. Now, if we lend money for education projects in which we encourage countries to use EdTech, that indirectly creates a demand for EdTech startups. And so we need to think strategically about the things we do as a development bank, and how some of them will indirectly affect the startup system and create the demand for startups and their products.
Fantastic. Paul, thank you very much indeed. And panelists, Balor, Sherwin, and Eli, thank you as well for taking part in this. And thanks to VP Ashok Lavasa, who kicked us all off. We're going to have to call it quits there. We're at the end of our time. I'm sorry to Donald Sinclair in Sri Lanka. We didn't just, your question arrived just a moment too late. for us to fit it into that situation. But thanks, everybody. Let's say call it quits there, and I'll hand it back to Nat for some final comments.
Thanks, Timur.
Thanks, Timur. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Natalie, are you
you.
there?
Thank you so much.
Well, that concludes our session. And before we wrap up, please take a minute to take the poll and tell us what you thought of today's program. Once you leave the session, you will also receive an email from us to fill a short survey to provide us with feedback. Your feedback will help us improve our curation of future events, and we thank you in advance for your time. And that wraps up today's event, and we have many more exciting talks and fantastic lineup of speakers in store later this afternoon, as well as the rest of the week. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back at Digital X ADB.